Hello! In this video I'm going to take you through how to mix up an acid dye for dyeing protein fibres. So that would be wool, silk, mohair or any other kind of fibre derived from an animal. So the first thing we're going to need to do for this is to weigh the dry weight of our fabric and then make a note of this weight. From this we can then calculate how much dye and how much fixative we need. So we multiply the weight of the fabric by 0.01 for dye and 0.06 for ammonium sulfate, which is our fixative. Once you've calculated how much fixative and dye you need, you can then soak your fabric using warm water. This just helps when you then begin to dye your fabric, just get a really lovely even dye. You also want to make sure that your fabric is clean before dyeing it as well. Again, this helps with making sure it's nice and even. So you'll need a mask, gloves and apron while working with powders, and you'll also need to work in the extraction booth. Using a clean container, begin to weigh out your dye. For this I'm using Acid Intense Black. As you're weighing out your dye, you want to be as precise as you can, so sometimes that can take a little while to get it spot on. And you can just tap the scales if they're not quite responding, just gently, just to prompt them into working. If you do go a little bit over or under how much dye you needed, that's okay. Just make sure that you're keeping really good notes so that you can replicate the colour that you're producing. Once you've weighed your dye, you then want to add in a small amount of warm water and then mix it up into a paste. Making it into a paste first assists with the dye dissolving properly. You can then continue to add more water until you've got a bit of a dye solution. You can set this aside. Using another clean container, we'll now begin to weigh out the ammonium sulfate. And once you've got the exact amount of ammonium sulfate needed, you can then again add in some water to dissolve the ammonium sulfate. Unlike the dye, you don't need to make a paste out of the ammonium sulfate, so you can just add water into that and stir it very thoroughly to make sure that it's all completely dissolved. So once you've prepared your dye and your ammonium sulfate, you can then begin dyeing. So it's a hot water dye process, so you will need to have had a health and safety induction for using the heat plate safely. Please do not use the heat plates if you've not had an induction. So we'll place a bucket of water that contains at least 3 litres of water on the heat plate. We need at least 3 litres just to make sure that the dye bucket does not boil dry. Stir in the aluminium sulfate and make sure that it's mixed in thoroughly. And then you can add in the acid dye. Again, stirring it thoroughly to make sure that it's properly dissolved and you don't have any small specks of dye floating on top of your dye liquid. Once you've added in your ammonium sulfate and your dye, you can then add your fabric into the dye bucket. So the length of time that you dye your fabric for depends on the shade required. You want to get your temperature quite hot, so kind of maybe a gentle boil, but you don't want it to be too hot when you're dyeing silk, or you can start to affect the luster of the fabric. Once you've finished, you would switch off your heat plate, and then you can take your fabric over to the sinks using a jug to collect any drips. And then you can wash out your fabric using Manutex until the water has run completely clear. If you've got any questions about that, just speak to a technician.